Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we're going to be having a fun video for you today. So we're going to be showcasing, of course, the Rat City Impaler, the Lament of the Lost Refuge. Now, before I get into the video, I have a few disclaimers. This is on the Crash the Server Party Event server, meaning that not all of these changes are final. Also, as well, like I said, normally I would play these builds to higher corruption to show the quality of the builds, but I can't really do that when I need to try so many and I only have so much limited time. So we're cutting it short. So of course I can work on the next build and show you guys all the wonderful things that are coming in the next patch. Now, Spear, the spear, we're just going to call it the spear. So it is a community designed unique. And wait, before you click out the video, I know it sounds bad, okay? But hear me out, okay? The spear itself, so far from my experience, is absolutely amazing. Like the spear itself, the stats it gives, the kind of like things it allows you to do, all of that combined is great. The problem is it's tied to one of the most Papega skills in the game, Volcanic Orb. Now, one of the problems of Volcanic Orb is it is essentially like it is inspired by Diablo 2's Frozen Orb. But Diablo 2 Frozen Orb, it has a lot more projectiles. Like I'm saying, like a lot more. As you can see on the screen, they're like little pew pew projectiles. Frozen Orb just spams the whole screen with projectiles, and that's what makes Frozen Orb a good skill. And of course, that lacks from its last Epoch brother, Volcanic Orb. And this leads to a lot of problems. The biggest problem with, of course, Volcanic Orb is it's clear just sucks. It's clear, it just sucks. No matter what you do, it's clear sucks. Because the little projectiles, you just don't poop enough of them out to clear things in a decent amount of time, which means that we have to look for other means for clear. Now, Volcanic Orb is also known for some of the stupidest single target in the game, second to like Lightning Blast and stuff like that, because if you did not know, the little shrapnel balls, if each one can hit the same enemy, right? So if you put the little ball inside the enemy, it will get hit by all the shrapnel, and the damage is amazing, especially when you get multiple volcanic orbs on the same boss. Now, this is problematic though, because it kind of leads to kind of like an unhealthy use of the skill where you use it for nuking bosses and you don't actually use it for, of course, what a normal skill would be for clear and stuff like that. And that is the biggest problem with this entire build is the fact that we're forced to use Volcanic Orb. But let's talk about the spear. So the biggest thing that the spear brings to the table is the fact that it is on a really good base. The Rat City Impaler base, it's a new base for this spear specifically, gives like 100 flat void and 150 melee adaptive damage. Obviously, we don't need that melee adaptive damage, but that flat spell void is insane. That's about as much as a staff, and that leads to a lot of implications later on in terms of being able to force spells into different damage types, which is great. And of course, it makes it so whenever you cast your Volcanic Orb, or you have a chance of when you get hit by one of the little projectiles, you get a stack of like these stacks that give you a bunch of flat void damage, a bunch of movement speed, and a bunch of mana regen. And all of this is great. The stacks are wonderful. They're absolutely wonderful. Like I said, they're just tied to like one of the most annoying skills ever. One thing as well is when you hit enemies with a melee tech, you reduce Volcanic Orb cooldown by a certain amount. And all of this combined leads to a really strong weapon. It's just the community forgot one thing. Right now, last Epoch, non-crit stuff does not work. Non-crit is not a option, quote unquote, unless if you have absurd damage numbers, like just non-crit hit. And this leads to problems specifically with this spear where where's all the base crit, right? Normally on most spell skills, you have like a wand or a rune dagger, which has base crit, and then you have a catalyst or something like that, which also has base crit. And of course, we can't get that base crit on our weapon, which means that we have to do other things like run Prismatic Gaze for the base crit, or we can run Locket of the Forgotten Knight. and that will lead us to getting enough base crit to make the build feel good. And that's one of the biggest problems of the build, is one of the biggest solutions to this build is to utilize, of course, the body armor. Now, this body armor that's on screen right now, essentially what it does is it makes it so that each fire aura you have gives you a bunch of increased void damage. This is great because we're scaling a bunch of void damage, which normally would not be easily scalable on a sorcerer or a spellblade in this case, because there's no increased damage for that on their tree. Usually you get around to like 5, 6 with our current setup, but there's also an affix that gives you fire aura on crit, and that can lead us to a few extra stacks as well. Since we're critting so much per second, we'll be getting a bunch of fire auras off of that, and that's a lot more increased damage too. So having that on your helmet and your chest would be absolutely wonderful, but since we're forced into so many unique options, this means that it makes the Rat City Impaler a very high investment item. This build did not start feeling good enough for empowered monos, in my opinion, until we got the large crit chance roll on the Rat City Impaler. I managed to drop a 1 LP one, which was great, which means that I could roll crit on it, and it felt wonderful and dandy after that. But without that crit roll, it felt kind of awkward, not really having enough crit chance to, make things die, right? Now, overall, like I said, build's been great. We're going to go in game and I'm going to do like a full build showcase because this is more of a new build. If you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video, as that's the best way to support the channel. Sorry if this isn't as bombastic as you wanted your Rat City Spear to be, but I tried my best. Let's go in game, shall we? All right, here I am getting with the build. Like I said, planner isn't updated with everything, so I'm just going to pause on things. First things off, we're going to talk about the spear. This spear, I'm gonna be honest, like it's good and all, but it's tied to one of the worst skills it possibly could be tied to. This could be tied to almost any other skill in the game, specifically sorcerers, and it would be absolutely wonderful. The fact that it's tied to Volcanic Orb brings it down a few notches. Otherwise, it would probably be one of the best and most interesting uniques in the entire game. So, the community did a really good job on designing this. It's just the problem is Volcanic Orb is about a 2 to 3 year old skill that hasn't had an update in a long time and existed in a time in last Epoch where you did like 1 monolith per hour. Now, let's talk about Volcanic Orb skill tree. TLDR, you just want as much shrapnel damage as possible, because if you didn't know, shrapnel damage is what is doing your single target, because the orb is inside the target and it's rotating and it's shooting shrapnel inside of the target, then piercing out of it and, of course, dealing all your damage. So you want all the shrapnel damage here, the shrapnel damage here. Just so you know, this node does not change Frozen Orb, Volcanic Orb into Frozen Orb if you have the Rat City Impaler. The Rat City Impaler takes precedence over this and is so it's converted to void instead of like cold, right? Of course, more damage here with Glacial Might, so we just get more damage against chilled enemies, which is great. This is actually one of the best things about this spear, is the fact we get to grab this node and this node at the same time, because, of course, more damage is great. We grab some more damage here. This is one of the most annoying nodes on the tree because it essentially forces you to take the 50% more shrapnel damage, but we also get negative shrapnel frequency. If you don't know what that means how much shrapnel shoots out. Now we have this node here that gives us even more shrapnel frequency, but we're already at such a negative, there's no point in investing into this. And the reason why this is annoying is because this is the only way of getting to the pierce, which is the only way to make the clear on shrapnel on the shrapnel on Volcanic Orb actually feel decent. So if there was a way that this node could be allocated without having to touch Monolithic Eruption, that means that this entire skill would be a lot better, because you'd be able to puke out more projectiles without losing a lot of damage, because it may look like a damage buff here, but it's actually indeed a damage loss, because we get less projectiles, which means less clear and less single target consistency, and of course the mana generation nodes are behind it as well. But yeah, that is one of the biggest problems with this skill, is the fact that the Pierce is behind the worst node in the entire tree for Volcanic Orb. Now, of course, we have Firebrand. Firebrand set up just to give us a bunch of spell flat damage. It is adaptive, and that will change into Void thanks to the fact that Volcanic Orb's base damage is turned into Void, as you can tell here, which is great. Just getting a bunch of Firebrand stuff, we just spam Firebrand and it feels great. Get a bunch of ward per second as well, because ward per second is one of our only defensive layers until we can invest into something like a Vessel of Strife, which is a lot of investment. So you're going to be sticking with this kind of setup for a while. Mana Strike setup so that every 4 seconds I smack something, I get a bunch of mana back. It's really great because it means that I don't have to spend that long using focus, stuff like that. So it's great. And of course, we have Flame Ward, stereotypical Flame Ward setup, not really much different. We do grab the Flame Ward Fire Aura thing because we get extra damage for Fire Aura. Static. Now, this is the most interesting note on most interesting part about this build is we actually use static here. I'm moving my face here so you can see everything. We're actually using static to enhance our clear. Static just gets up to like 100 charges, and it shoots out a bunch of lightning projectiles that can hit like enemies and stuff like that. Now, the thing is, this is great for us, like really, really good for us because of the fact that our flat void on Lament is not adaptive. The flat void we get from corrupted heraldry is not adaptive. This means that since all of our void damage scaling is coming from Dark Shroud of Cinders, we get all void damage, and this will apply to static. This applies to every other skill in the game, like every other melee skill, right? I'm sorry, not melee. Every other spell skill. This applies to, like, you could do it with like maybe Lightning Blast, you could do it with Fireball, you could do it with Snap Freeze, Ellie Nova, Static Orb, Ice Barrage, Black Hole, Meteor. Doesn't matter what you choose, you can use it anything because of the fact that it is type damage and it is not, of course, adaptive, which is one of the strongest things about Lament of the Lost Refuge is being able to force things into Void, take advantage of Dark Shroud of Cinders, and stuff like that. So we use static because it's just the easiest to use while we're walking around using Volcanic Orb instant, and they buffed it recently so that it gets like 400% more damage, which is great because that just makes it do enough damage to clear trash. And of course, we're taking a bunch of damage. We'll use charge when hit, so we charge it up faster. We have the reset at max charges, so we can spam it a bunch. Ward per charge, it's 100 ward per time we press the button. 3 extra enemies hit here. Then base crit, which is great because we have almost no base crit anywhere else. This node behind me gives us 2 additional hits as well, because you want as many additional hits as possible because it's 5, then you get 8, and then another 2, so that's 10 targets per time you press the button. Then this node specifically, the one behind my head here, is the most important. Surge. You gain charges for each enemy you critically strike if you've discharged in the last 3 seconds. This is insanely strong because we throw out our Volcanic Orb. It's critting a bunch. Our attacks are critting a bunch. Static will also charge this up as well. This means that we get to 100 charges quick enough, and we use it for extra clear and a little bit of extra single target. So all in all, very good. Some things I would like to change. I would like to get these nodes here to get more static charges on single target so we can do more single target, because being able to run static and Volcanic Orb at the same time is better DPS overall. So that's pretty much it for the skills. Now for the passives here, I'm just going to hover over them. They're pretty self-explanatory. Mainly we're going over the usual Spellblade setup. We just want as much crit as possible, as much intelligence, eventually as much intelligence as possible, because Spellblade stuff. I'm grabbing cast speed here because it's very slow to cast Volcanic Orb when you're in monos, which sucks. Then we get all the Fire Aura stuff because of our chest, more Fire Aura stuff, more ward stuff, more DRs, stuff like that. Everything that we would ever want. Now, Mental Fortitude and Prodigy is insanely strong right now, as it gives us an insane amount of ward per second, which makes this build actually have a defensive layer on top of its HP. So all of this combined means that we can end up being tanky enough to actually tank things in the end game. Now, for gearing, I did not unlock the last idols. For some reason, they bugged out on me, and I haven't felt like fixing it because I've been too busy trying to make the build work. You could just shove another resistance idol up there or something like that. Now, of course, we're using Prismatic Gaze. Prismatic Gaze gives us a bunch of base crit, which means since the Rat City Sphere doesn't have any base crit, it makes up for the fact of that, right? If this just had just generic base crit, this would be so much better. Like that's all they would have to do, and the skill would go from good enough to amazing. Of course, Lament of the Lost Refuge. This spear is great. The spear is great. The skill is bad. The spear is great. Overall, this is going to lead to a lot of interesting builds where you use Volcanic Orb as a secondary skill just to get the corrupted heraldry stacks. And of course, you can use the 106 spell void damage and all the spell void damage on it as well. I managed to roll crit on it and it made it feel really good. You can also get attack speed. Dark Shrouded Cinders. I was trying to get the Fire Aura on crit on this. I did not after 3 attempts, but we mainly want the increased void damage per Fire Aura. We get like 5 to 10 Fire Auras right now. If we get a bit more, of course, investment going on, we get like some Fire Aura on crit idle stuff set up. We get Fire Aura on crit on the prefix here, Fire Aura on crit on Prismatic Gaze. That means we can get more Fire Auras, which is more increased damage, which will scale our Volcanic Orb damage, and of course our static damage to the moon, which would be great. I'm using one Siphon of Anguish, mainly because that void damage leeches life. That plus the movement speed is great. It means that, you know, we can, of course, leech from our void damage when we otherwise would not be able to. I am grabbing the Void Shred Blessing, so we cannot grab Spell Damage Leech, which means that we're forced into using this. So, yeah. Belt, HP, Mana Regen, crit. You want as much crit as humanly possible. Crit here, Frailty, Shred. You do need to make sure you get some source of Shred, otherwise your damage will be poo-poo. Of course, cast speed, crit chance, res, movement speed, and this could eventually have plus to Volcanic Orb, eventually. But, like, overall, my gear is pretty shit other than Lament of the Lost Refuge. This is like amazing. Everything else is absolute vendor trash. Even the Prismatic Gaze is not max rolled. So, to be fair, this build's actually doing really well, considering it's doing empowered monos already on such a shitty setup. Now, one of the most important things you need to have for Volcanic Orb is, of course, these idols. These idols reduce Volcanic Orb speed and increase its damage. This means that it will stay there in one spot and not move, which means it can sit inside of a boss and deal damage. One of the biggest problems, though, is you have to actually aim the Volcanic Orb. Aiming the Volcanic Orb is really annoying in a boss fight because you don't really have enough time to think. Eventually, if you play the build more, you can eventually aim it better. But right now, I'm having problems with aiming the Volcanic Orb and getting it inside the bosses. But once you get them inside the bosses, it's great. And this is great for big bosses like Jurla, Lagan, and like Emperor Dragon, stuff like that. So overall, you'll have a good time on most bosses. Even Oribus is thick enough to get hit by the Volcanic Orbs. But that's pretty much it for the character. Like I said, for blessings, we're just using Voice Shred. Word per second, we have Phys Res, Crit Avoid, Armor, and that's pretty much it, right? That's pretty much it for the build. Being said, this has been Dread. I hoped that this was going to be a little bit better, but it's definitely not bad or terrible as I had assumed it was going to be. All that being said, this has been Dread.